This screencast is intended to give some background information for Professor Huffman's video. Professor Huffman and his respondents gave a very high level of discussion and presentation regarding free market environmentalism, and so what I wanted to do was to give some background information that they often assumed that you all knew, and I'm here to make sure that you do know it. So let's begin with some of those background definitions. One term that you will often hear is the phrase command and control. This refers to a regulation or a regulatory system that simply is top-down. The Environmental Protection Agency often does this, and so they basically establish commands for how processes should be engaged in, how somebody should do a various procedure. This is an explicit contradistinction to setting a goal and allowing the company to adapt towards that goal. Now, command and control is oftentimes viewed across the political spectrum. Is viewed as a failure, and so as a result, we're starting to see people meander towards more of an emphasis on market. Around 7 minutes into the lecture, Professor Huffman will list many of the thinkers in this tradition. The early thinkers include a lot of people, including Professor Huffman himself, Terry Anderson, and P.J. Hill. There are a number of contemporary thinkers in this tradition, and it's important to realize that these thinkers don't necessarily all agree. They're all interested in the role that the free market can play in protecting the environment and in helping environmental stewardship, but there are many different thinkers in this tradition now, including economists, public choice thinkers, political scientists, and lawyers. So if you're interested in finding some more thinkers, Jonathan Adler is a big name in this tradition, and he has a couple of these websites that I'm listing here for you. He has listed some of the classic works in the free market environmentalism tradition, and he's put out a couple of books that are a collection of essays from some big thinkers in the tradition. All right, let's move on to some additional definitions that the speakers will assume that you know. One term that you will hear is rent seeker. A rent seeker is somebody who has decided that it is just easier to steal than to create. Why produce wealth when you can simply use the political systems to steal from somebody else who has created wealth? Those of us who are very concerned with justice oftentimes think of politics as fundamentally about rectifying injustice, but others see the political system as a way to simply take material wealth from those who have it. Another term that you will hear is transaction costs, and I have another screencast where I go into a bit more information on this, but transaction cost would simply be the cost of obviously engaging in a transaction. The higher the transaction cost, the less likely the transaction is to occur. If I have a baseball card worth $50 and it's going to cost me $30 in order to sell it on a website, I'm less likely to do it because I would only gain $20 of currency in exchange of losing a $50 card. Now, what's been interesting is economists have come to realize that transaction costs are also high in the governmental realm, and in fact, in most situations, transaction costs are higher in the political arena than they are in the marketplace. In the political arena, it turns out you have to purchase agreements from many more parties than you would have to in a market-based system. Complete information is a term that economists like to use. It's an assumption that everyone is coming with the same information, and as a result, then trades will be mutually beneficial. If you do not have complete information, then you do not necessarily have mutually beneficial trade. If you have a Honus Wagner baseball card that's worth a great deal of money, but you think it's just a strange piece of paper, then you'll exchange it to me for $100, and you'll think initially that you're better off until you discover how much I sold the card for, and then you will never speak to me again. So complete information is an assumption, but it rarely actually occurs in all, or it does not occur perfectly in all transactions, and so many economic debates arise over whether a trade is a good one when you have high transaction costs or when you do not have complete information. The term free rider, this is something that everyone who has spent any time on campus knows about. In the student government body, in student clubs, almost always you have a couple of students who work very hard to make the club work, and then you have everyone else who is a free rider. They will take a position in the club, put it on the resume, and then do no work, for example. This occurs in committees, it occurs across the economic and political arena. Free riders are a big problem. The question then is, how do you deal with free riders? In the lecture that you are about to watch, there are several definitions that are somewhat unique to the water market. The first is the term riparian land, that riparian, I'm sorry, it's not riparian land, it should be riparian rights. Riparian land is going to be land that is adjacent to water, so it's going to be water rights that occur for somebody who has land that's adjacent to that water. Prior appropriation just means that it is the water rights were given to somebody who had previously been appropriating or using it. And so this is a form of water rights that is much more common on the West Coast. The West Coast, of course, then would be largely used by farmers, at least in the past. Usufruct is a fancy legal term. It simply means the right of use. I'm using it, therefore I have a right to use it in some way. Tragedy of the commons is a very famous term that developed. The theory was that if you have a commons and everyone is allowed to use it, then it will typically be overused. If everyone can take their cattle onto the commons and then use the commons, then we will all immediately put our cattle on the commons in order to eat it, to eat as much as possible, and it would destroy the commons. It's worth noting that the tragedy of the commons, it turns out, isn't quite as necessary or as necessary as we used to think. There have been several scholars who have noted that that there are several small homogeneous communities that have managed to keep the commons going for quite some time. But it seems to require those small homogeneous communities. The larger the community, the more diverse the community, the more likely you get a tragedy of the commons. Now, this particular lecture, I think, is a very good lecture because of the interaction that we get amongst all three scholars. And so, in many ways, what I want you to get out of this are the questions that they are interested in asking. It turns out they have a lot of agreement. They are approaching many issues, many of the same sorts of issues, and I think that regardless of how you answer these questions, I think they're very important questions. One of the first questions is, how do we establish the rules for the market? That's an important question. You can be in favor of free market environmentalism, but it can beg the question, well, what rules should help guide that market? The next question that's also very important is, what are the institutions in that nation like? Particularly in the 80s and 90s, there may have been a belief that the free market itself would solve all problems, but it turns out that the free market requires strong institutions. You have to have a judicial system that is not going to be bribed easily. You need a concern for the rights of all, including minorities. And so these are, of course, very important for political scientists. And then what about the anti-commons? This is something that has already been covered if you have watched Professor Bretson's lecture. The anti-commons is simply when you have a commons where there are too many people who have veto rights. What happens if we all can say no, and it turns out that nothing ever happens? That's another great question. Also, notice the distinction between equality and efficiency. Professor Huffman has a very interesting distinction between these two. He wants to separate them in order to say that we can, by separating equality and efficiency, deal with both equally well. We could have the marketplace that would ensure efficiency, and then the political arena, perhaps, that could establish a way of creating equality so that, for example, the poor could also enjoy the park system. And then finally, a final important question is, how should we flexibly respond to technological change? The two classic examples that are mentioned are going to be oil and then wetlands. Things that used to be thought of as an unmitigated evil are now considered to be a good thing. So how do we respond to these things? When should politics respond? And of course, one of the free market arguments has always been that the market will typically respond more quickly than will politics. So again, these are questions that are there are not necessarily obvious answers for, but they are the big questions that I think free market environmentalism both causes us to ask and potentially gives us some answers for.